Okay, let's unpack this. It's a really complex, sometimes contradictory look at, the roles of men and women across different times and places. You sent over some fascinating material for us to get into, specifically this video, right? Exploring a perceived domination by the West over gender roles. And it contrasts Western history and modern stuff with perspectives from Islamic tradition and specific cultural practices. So the big question it seems to pose is, has how we define these roles always been the same? How have things really changed?
Well, what's interesting is the source itself, this video transcript, it weaves together quite a lot. You got historical narrative, media analysis, culture, critique, even personal stories mixed in with religious texts and like international agreements. It's quite a mix.
Definitely. So our job here, our mission for this deep dive, is to pull out the key arguments, the historical claims, the comparisons, the impacts it talks about. Basically, help you understand what's in this source material without getting lost. And just to be clear, we're exploring the points raised by the source. We're not here to endorse them, especially when things get sensitive. It's about understanding the perspective presented. So let's dive in. Where does the source even begin this story?
It takes us way back, about 300 years ago, it says, before the steam engine really changed things.
Okay, pre-industrial revolution. What was life like then, according to this source?
It paints a picture of life being, mostly farm-based, the father's role, largely outside, farming, handling animals, hunting, that sort of stuff. The mother's role was, well, centered inside the home, raising the children. And the source frames this very clearly, claiming this was the system, like from the time of Prophet Noah right up until the steam engine arrived.
Wow. It's just hard to imagine how fundamentally different that world sounds compared to today, isn't it?
Completely different.
And here's where the source says things get really interesting. It claims the steam engine,
Yeah.
it actually broke that old system.
Exactly. That's the argument. Because the steam engine led to factories, right? And factories were popping up in cities. So this caused a huge shift, a migration away from farms and into these new urban centers. The source mentions that fathers often moved first, sometimes leaving the family behind initially. And the factory life it describes.
Yeah.
It sounds brutal. We're talking 12, even 16-hour days. Basically just work, sleep, repeat.
Not much time for anything else then.
Not at all. And the source argues this drastically changed the father's role within the family unit. His presence at home became minimal, kind of marginalized. Families just got used to him being gone all the time. So his main responsibility, the source claims, shifted. It wasn't about being involved at home or with the kids anymore. It became almost solely about bringing in money.
That's a really interesting point it makes about literature reflecting this too. It says old Western lit praised men for things like ethics, knowledge, but modern literature, it praises them for money because, and this is the source's quote, ethics don't bring livelihood.
Yeah, the pretty cynical take there. And it goes further, arguing that the media then kind of piled on, reinforcing this diminished, marginalized role for men.
How so? What kind of portrayals does it point to?
It claims there are basically two main negative ways men get shown. First, as violent, backward, maybe woman-hating. It gives Patrick Bateman from American Psycho as an example, using women just for himself. And the second way, as like cute, pampered, almost helpless.
Jealous.
Yeah, helpless.
Huh.
It mentions Peter Griffin from Family Guy shown as stupid, needing Lois to be the calm, wise one who disciplines him. Or even Eren from Attack on Titan portrayed as weak, a crybaby, while Mikasa is the strong protector figure.
Huh. And it mentions books that supposedly push this idea too.
It does. Books like The End of Man and The Rise of Women and Manning Up. And it makes a specific point about the cover of Manning Up, claiming it shows a kid in a suit, trying to imply that, men are being depicted as children.
There is an ad example too, wasn't there?
Right, a specific one for a big chips brand. It showed a grown man basically having a tantrum, like a toddler screaming, crying just to get chips from his wife.
And that AI experiment it mentioned was quite something.
Yeah, that was interesting. Asking for a joke about men got like a harmless Wi-Fi comparison.
But asking for one about women...
The AI apparently refused, citing its guidelines.
So the source argues all this media exposure has a real effect.
A powerful, indirect influence, it claims. People subconsciously pick up these ideas, maybe even start using the terminology. It throws out terms like red pill, selective hunting, cognitive dissonance, tribal replacement, and it links these ideas back to evolutionary psychology, mentioning Darwin. Richard Dawkins is the selfish gene. But it's critical, saying these complex ideas get used superficially online by people who don't really understand them.
Okay, so that's the picture it paints for the West, but then it shifts gears, right? It says this doesn't necessarily apply everywhere and offers a different view from Arab or Islamic culture.
Exactly. It presents a contrast. It describes a certain kind of upbringing it claims is common for some Arab children. Ideas like not showing emotion easily or the concept of taking their right by hand.
Hmm.
Now, the source initially frames this quite negatively, suggesting it removes humanity, but it does seem to qualify that a bit later on.
And it uses examples from the Prophet Muhammad's life as a counterpoint.
Yes, peace be upon him, to show a different model. For emotions, it cites him expressing love for his wife Aisha openly, even among other men. And to counter the idea that manliness equals force, it refers to a hadith, a saying or tradition stating he never struck a woman, a servant, or anyone, really, except in jihad, meaning self-defense or sanctioned struggle. The point being, force wasn't the go-to for proving masculinity.
So the source suggests that first type of upbringing, the one focused on suppressing emotion, could lead to men being emotionally stunted. Dry was the word used.
That's the potential negative outcome it raises, yes, dry. But then, importantly, it presents its definition of what it calls a real man, drawing directly from Quranic verses and hadith. It argues being a man isn't just about biology, it's about principles, values. It highlights three key responsibilities. First, general responsibility, quoting the hadith, each of you is a shepherd responsible for his flock. Leadership and care. Second, providing for the family. It cites a Quranic verse saying men are in charge or maintainers based on what God has favored them with and because of what they spend from their wealth. It stresses that this role, this guardianship, is conditional on providing financially. And a wife could even seek judgment if he neglects this duty. And third, self-control, referencing another hadith. The truly strong person isn't the wrestler, but the one who controls their anger. This prevents problems, the source says, and it emphasizes these three responsibility, provision, self-control are key, with the foundation being religion and ethics.
Okay, let's pivot again. The source then goes back into Western history, but this time focusing on the treatment of women. What perspective does it offer there?
It talks about what it labels the Dark Ages, claiming women were viewed with significant religious and philosophical disdain. It uses the Council of Macon as an example, alleging there was a debate on whether women were fully human, and the conclusion was they were like second-class humans.
That's quite a claim, and it mentions other, even more shocking historical practices.
Yes, it does, like wife selling. In 18th century Britain, it claims this was documented, apparently cheaper than getting a divorce. The source describes women being tied up like animals, and the reasons given: paying off debts, or simply for the husband's pleasure. Really grim stuff.
And there was that punishment device, the scold's bridle.
The scold's bridle, exactly. A cage fitted over the head with a metal gag to silence women deemed disobedient or nagging. The source links this to an idea that a woman's voice was considered disruptive, like barking.
So the narrative the source builds here is one of women feeling trapped by these conditions.
Right. And according to the source, when they turned to Christianity for help, they found it actually blamed them, pointing to Eve's sin, and seemed to sanction their oppression, even their sale. It also claims reading was forbidden for women, the fear being that knowledge would incite rebellion. So the source argues women came to realize that their religion, at least as it was being interpreted and practiced then, wasn't going to provide the justice they needed.
Moving forward in time, the French Revolution comes up. How does the source frame its impact?
Initially, as a moment of hope, the shift from church dominance to secular law led women to expect they'd finally get rights.
But that didn't happen.
According to the source, no. They were largely ignored. And this, it argues, is what fueled figures like Olympe de Gouges to actively demand equal rights, voting, education, work, holding husbands accountable. The source points to her execution as a sign of how threatening these demands were seen as rebellion.
And this sparked wider protests, the women's liberation movement.
That's the connection the source makes, yeah. Leading eventually to some legal changes, early 20th century, around marriage, education.
Then the world wars enter the picture. The source sees them as a major turning point.
Absolutely huge, according to the source. Men went off to fight, leaving massive gaps in the workforce. Governments actively promoted women entering factories, farms, you name it, to keep things running. And women, the source claims, discovered not only that they could do these men's jobs, but that many actually enjoyed working, enjoyed the independence.
So after the wars, when the men came back,
They expected women to just go back home. But the source says many women didn't want to. They'd had a taste of something different.
and this tension led to new ideas emerging.
That's the argument. Ideas like the home being a kind of prison, the husband a jailer. Motherhood started being portrayed negatively as ignorance, maybe. And men, in some circles, became framed as the enemy. This whole dynamic, the source suggests, really paved the way for what we think of as modern feminist thought.
What specific feminist ideas does the source highlight from that era?
It mentions things like the slogan, "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle." That kind of independence. A huge emphasis on freedom over her own body, covering abortion rights, sexual freedom under that "My Body, My Choice" banner. And also the acceptance of LGBT identities, specifically mentioning the phrase "trans women are women" as part of this broader shift.
Okay, so after outlining that historical trajectory, the source offers a really provocative view on who actually benefited from all these changes. What's the claim?
The claim is pretty starch. It wasn't primarily women who benefited, but governments and capitalists.
Okay, why? What reasons does it give for that?
It lays out a few key arguments. First, cheap labor. When women flooded the workforce, it basically doubled the labor pool. Good for productivity, maybe, but the source argues it drove down wages for everyone. Second, more taxes. Simple logic. More employed people means more taxpayers. A woman working pays taxes. A woman at home traditionally didn't in the same way. The source sees this as a win for the state's coffers. And third, what it calls family disintegration. With both parents likely working, who raises the kids full-time? The source argues the state steps into that gap daycare, schools becoming more central. And it claims this gives the state more influence over shaping the next generation's thinking.
Does it offer any evidence or examples to back up this, frankly, quite controversial perspective?
It does mention a couple of things. It references an article by Nancy Fraser titled "How Feminism Became Capitalism's Handmaiden," and it makes an allegation about Gloria Steinem, the founder of Ms. Magazine, suggesting she promoted this superwoman ideal juggling career and family, and that she might have received CIA funding back in the 60s, implying some level of state interest in promoting these ideas.
Right. So following that critique, the source then paints a really bleak picture of the actual reality for Western women today, despite the legal rights they've gained.
Yeah, it shifts to describing what it sees as major ongoing problems. One big one is debt. It points specifically to the massive U.S. student loan debt, quoting a figure around $1.66 trillion. And it draws a direct and quite disturbing line from this debt to something it calls sugar dating.
Sugar dating.
Yes, it claims female students are increasingly selling themselves, their companionship or more, to older, wealthier men, mentioning an average age of 38 plus new, often businessmen using specific apps like Sugar Daddy Meet. The primary motivation, according to the source, paying off crippling university debt.
Oh, okay, what else?
Another major theme is sexual commodification, the idea that women are reduced from whole human beings to just sexual objects or commodities. It links back to that U.S. survey I mentioned earlier, where attractiveness was supposedly ranked as the most important trait for women, and claims studies discussing this are treated as just normal.
And harassment. That seemed like a huge focus.
Absolutely massive. It throws out some really shocking statistics, citing an EU report and various articles. Things like 1 in 3 European girls over 15, 2 in 4 women over 18 facing harassment. It claims 100% of girls experience it on public transport in France. Over half of female university students in the UK. High rates in workplaces, 1 in 4 UK office workers, 1 in 2 US employees. Even between doctors, nurses, and patients. And it adds this detail about some shop owners allegedly forcing female staff into tight clothing.
And the source connects this to women having fewer safety nets.
Yes, what it calls a lack of refuge. The argument is, if you've pushed for independence and maybe moved away from traditional family support, and then you face serious harassment at work, where do you go? There's no easy escape back to a family home, potentially.
What about the psychological toll?
The source claims it's immense. Women suffering mentally, feeling humiliated, developing self-hatred because of constant harassment. And it argues this harassment is basically everywhere, even alleging U.S. psychotherapists admit to harassing patients, and citing a UK study where 70% of police employees reported harassment.
Domestic violence comes up too.
Yes, it mentions battered woman syndrome as being common. It cites stats claiming 1 in 4 women suffer strong beatings, and that over 1,200 women die each year in the U.S. from domestic violence. That's about 3 women every single day.
And the source tries to link the behavior of some men, the harassment, the violence, back to this idea of women being seen as commodities.
Exactly. It suggests this perceived craziness stems from women being viewed as sexual tools or second-class citizens, a direct result of this commodification process it describes.
Then there's a discussion on abortion. How does the source frame that?
It calls it a seemingly cute demand that it claims hides much bigger issues. It gives U.S. stats around 1 million abortions a year, 37% happening after 6 weeks. It includes a very graphic description of the surgical procedure. and makes a really pointed comparison to female infanticide, which is condemned in the Quran but describes abortion as being like that, only wearing a lab coat.
So it really questions the value of what we often call progress.
Deeply. It asks, what's the point of individual achievements, like winning a Nobel Prize? It uses Francis Arnold as an example. If society as a whole can't raise a generation that respects women, or if ethics seem to be crumbling while technology races ahead.
And it loops back to the idea that even some feminists recognize negative outcomes.
Right. It reiterates that claim about figures like Nancy Fraser acknowledging how the feminist movement was perhaps unintentionally co-opted or used to justify exploitation.
Okay, so after that internal critique of the West, the source broadens its scope again, looking at international efforts, right? How Western ideas get spread.
Yeah, it turns to international agreements, focusing specifically on CEDAW.
CEDAW.
The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's a major UN treaty signed by almost all countries, 189 out of 193.
But the source raises a criticism about it.
A very pointed one. It claims the U.S. heavily promotes CEDAW around the world, especially pushing it on Muslim countries. But the U.S. itself hasn't actually ratified the treaty, and the reason cited, concerns about external bodies overriding U.S. law. So a perceived hypocrisy there.
And the source claims CEDAW is sometimes presented differently, depending on the audience.
Yes. It alleges that in Muslim societies, it's often marketed under the banner of women's empowerment because, the source claims, educated people know what CEDAW really wants, implying its true aims, as seen by the source, are perhaps more controversial.
What specific demands does the source say CEDAW makes? It mentioned Palestine.
It did, citing a UN Women article. The demands listed included abolishing male guardianship. It uses the term qawama, which is a complex concept in Islamic tradition, often related to male responsibility and provision within the family. Also, abolishing laws against adultery, raising the marriage age uniformly to 18, laws against discrimination targeting LGBT individuals, allowing women to give birth in hospitals without needing a marriage certificate, making the treaty itself national law, and submitting regular progress reports.
There was also that mention of a video clip advocating for sports.
Right. A clip showing someone arguing that using sports like women playing football in shorts is a powerful political and cultural tool. The idea presented, according to the source, was that this projects a more acceptable modern image internationally, supposedly better than showing women in traditional veils.
So what's the source's final critique on this exporting of ideas?
It's pretty blunt. It basically asks, are Western countries, which the source argues are struggling with their own massive problems, harassment, abuse, even infanticide via abortion, sugar dating, homelessness, really in a position to tell others how to live. It frames it as potentially dragging other societies down with what it sees as failed Western models.
And it contrasts this push with suffering happening elsewhere.
Yes, it brings up examples from Muslim countries, asking why there isn't more international focus on these issues instead of pushing other agendas. It mentions Gaza, lack of basic necessities, bombing. Uyghur women alleged kidnapping, torture, children taken. Syrian women detained since 2011, tortured. The source questions the priorities, asking why Western countries focus on pushing certain rights while these situations persist.
And it expresses a kind of disbelief.
Yeah, disbelief that the West, given the internal problems the source outlines regarding women, would be the ones trying to teach Muslims about women's rights or treatment.
Okay, now this next point seems crucial for understanding the source's overall argument, distinguishing between culture and religion.
Absolutely key. The source is very clear on this. It openly acknowledges that, yes, traditional customs have oppressed Muslim women in many places and times. It gives examples. Arranged or forced marriages, so-called honor killings, women being denied education or their rightful inheritance, even customs like not showing her face to her husband initially, or fathers feeling they can just give away their daughters.
But the crucial argument is...
The crucial argument is that these injustices come from customs and traditions, often rooted in pre-Islamic ignorance or patriarchal interpretations, not from the core teachings of Islam itself. The source strongly claims that Islam originally came to liberate women from the very oppressions that existed before it.
And it suggests these customs sometimes overshadowed the religion.
Exactly. That cultural norms, concerns about reputation, what people will say, became more important than following actual religious guidance on what's lawful or forbidden. And tragically, it claims, many women themselves came to believe that these oppressive customs were part of their religion because that's what they were taught or saw practiced.
It brings up Nawal al-Saadawi in this context, doesn't it?
It does. It presents her as someone who witnessed this oppression by custom, but then, according to the source, advocated for atheism as the solution. The source claims she linked women's freedom to leaving illusory religions. But it contrasts this with her reported stance on the hijab being personal freedom, suggesting she was selectively exporting Western feminist ideas into the Arab world, possibly exploiting widespread ignorance about authentic Islamic teachings versus cultural baggage.
And it uses an analogy to clarify the distinction.
Yeah, a simple one. If you encounter a bad doctor, it doesn't mean the entire field of medicine is flawed or bad. Likewise, it argues, just because some Muslims practice harmful or oppressive customs, that doesn't invalidate the religion itself. You have to separate the two.
Okay, so bringing everything together, how does the source make its final comparison regarding the value of women?
It circles back to that core question. From Islam's perspective, as presented by the source, a person's value, man or woman, is based on their righteousness, their piety, their God consciousness. It quotes that Quranic verse, "Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you." So value isn't tied to gender or, crucially, physical appearance.
And how does it contrast this with its view of the West or the framework behind CEDAW?
You contrast it sharply. It claims the Western CEDAW perspective, in practice, ends up measuring a woman's value largely by her physical attractiveness and her potential for sexual commodification. It uses all those previously mentioned statistics about widespread harassment as evidence that this is the prevailing reality, regardless of stated ideals.
So on harassment specifically.
Islam's view, per the source, referencing a Quranic verse about slandering chaste women, implies severe consequences even for verbal harm. Protecting dignity is paramount, versus the claimed reality in the West where it alleges women can barely breathe due to the pervasiveness of harassment.
And on selection, like choosing a spouse.
Islam's guidance, citing the Hadith married religious woman, prioritizes character, religion, ethics, value based on inner qualities, not just the body, versus the claimed Western tendency, again linked to commodification, where selection is heavily influenced by physical appearance and sexual desirability.
What about care and support?
The source highlights a Hadith promising paradise for fathers who raise daughters well, emphasizing the importance of caring for and supporting female children. This is contrasted with the issues it previously raised in the West, the high rates of abortion, and women facing homelessness or lack of support.
And the source's final claim ties this all together.
Yes, it concludes by claiming that some Western women are starting to recognize that Islam, in its pure form, actually offers women full rights and genuine value, distinct from the issues they face. It points to statistics about women converting to Islam in places like the UK as evidence supporting this claim.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive. And yeah, intense at times. We've journeyed through a source that pulls from so much history, culture, media, religion to build a really strong, often critical argument about society, gender, and change. We touched on everything from, life 300 years ago, the steam engine's impact, 18th century wife selling, those awful punishments, right up to modern media, Family Guy, AI jokes, the critique of feminism's outcomes, sugar dating, CEDAW, and this fundamental contrast the source draws between cultural practices and religious ideals, and between its view of Western values versus Islamic values.
It's certainly a source that makes you stop and think.
Yeah.
About unintended consequences, about how different societies define worth, about how roles evolve or are imposed. And just to reiterate, we've been exploring the arguments, the claims, the information as presented in this specific source. Our aim was just to give you a clear window into its content, its perspective.
Absolutely. And it definitely leaves you, the listener, with some big questions to chew on. Like, how does a society's core definition of value for anyone, man or woman, actually shape everything from our personal lives right up to economics and global politics?
Indeed. And what happens when these very different cultural, religious, and historical frameworks collide or intersect in our incredibly fast-changing world? The way societies see and have seen the roles and worth of men and women, it has incredibly profound implications.
Well, thank you for bringing this source to us. It was
Yeah.
genuinely thought-provoking, a real deep dive.